Okay, good afternoon. We're going to start this special meeting of the Portsmouth Arts and Nonprofits Committee. It is Monday, the 28th at 12:09 p.m. And we have with us today former City Councilor Chris Dwyer and former ArtSpeak Chair Chris Dwyer. And I believe you were an ArtSpeak Chair as well, Ellen, right? So we've got some former ArtSpeak chairs here. They were involved with the 2002 cultural plan for the city of Portsmouth. So we've invited them here today to speak with us about what the process was like, to be able to ask some questions. It's sort of a first step in the process of moving toward creating a new cultural plan for the community. And I've been speaking with Nancy and Sean about how to handle the next steps moving forward with the city. So we're still in the early stages of this. So everyone please be aware of that. But this will be a really good informational meeting to get us up to speed and started on this. I do want to remind everyone that because we're recording this and we have some people at home at Zoom, when you speak, make sure you use a microphone to speak into. So welcome, Chris and Ellen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, no, it's exciting to have you here. And I think what I want to do just first is, rather than get directly into questions, ask if you might spend a couple of minutes just reminiscing with us about what your recollection of the experience of being on the committee was for the first cultural plan, how you, particularly in the starting and beginning of it, because that's what we're looking at right now. Then we can get really into depth on the whole process, but what it was like getting going and how that all came about with Mayor Sorrell. So take it away.
Why
don't you start with the earlier history? Because Ellen and I met to talk about our own recollections.
Excellent.
And work with Ellen's files. And there's a prehistory to when we did the cultural plan. And the prehistory is really important in this case. And Ellen was a part of the prehistory.
So let me begin, but also apologize that I will have to leave around 12:30 today. So I'm happy to continue to answer questions if things come up that Chris is unable or Nancy cannot answer, but I just wanted you to know that to begin with. So Art Builds Community was a special initiative of the Greater Piscataqua Community Foundation. And that's really where this started. There were 3 sites in New Hampshire that worked on arts and cultural issues. One was Newport, the other was Manchester, and the third was Portsmouth. And both the Manchester and the Portsmouth sites wound up with cultural plans of different sorts. And I think the one in Portsmouth was really the most extensive, and the process was really robust here. There was a steering committee that was commissioned to learn about what Portsmouth residents thought about arts and culture. There were 8 focus groups in March and April of 1998. And these were held at sites throughout the city. Over 80 citizens in Elwyn Park, the South End, downtown Atlantic Heights, and Spinnaker Point, to name a few, attended those meetings. So groups were also held at the high school and at Green Pages. Each 1-hour session began with an introduction to the project and its purposes. And the 8 to 10 group members said something about themselves. Then people were asked a series of very specific questions. Nancy, were you part of this piece too?
I don't think I was part of that initial piece. I think was the stage at Rock Street Park one of those initiatives?
No,
I don't think so.
That was just
so actually, even a prehistory to that, and why we had the Wallace Grant came out of the shipyard project that we did at the music hall. And so that had engaged a lot of people in different ways.
Right.
And that's why Portsmouth was one of the communities that received that grant.
gotcha.
lots of arts and cultural history here. So at the conclusion of each meeting, each person was asked to write down a comment about something that was said that they would like to see happen. And those became part of a kind of vision of what people wanted to see in the city of Portsmouth.
And Ellen coordinated that Arts Field Community project.
Correct.
So that's, so, you know, I think that groundwork is really important because the cultural plan was picking up from the stream work.
So then there was a committee that was, that committee included also individual artists, a Portsmouth Public School arts administrator, a social service organization person, some city employees, business people, high school student. So that I mentioned that I would be happy to photocopy this information. I don't have access personally to a photocopier, but if
you give it to me, I can scan it today. Run up
Okay.
and scan it.
Okay. So that was the beginning, and then Chris, we went from there.
Yeah, and then, so Mayor Sorrell, through that process, Mayor Sorrell had not been a fan of arts and culture, and to say the least. In fact, she was kind of known at that time as an enemy of activity. However, through that process, she heard from citizens, she heard the value, she understood that arts and culture wasn't just something that was like sold downtown, but was woven into the fabric of schools in the neighborhood. And she became a big fan, and she thought that the most important thing was to have arts and culture be a part of the city's master plan. And we were about to, 2 years hence, embark upon the master planning process. And that was the biggest master planning process in my time in the city. It was really, I don't think before that we had that kind of broad input master plan. And her idea, which was really brilliant, was that arts and culture, because typically is not a part of master plans anywhere, that it would need some more time to do its own planning process to then become kind of emerge into the master plan. And so it was her idea to do a blue ribbon committee that would do this planning that would eventually then merge into the city's master plan. And that, by the way, has set the stage for what other communities now do. Nobody had thought of that before. So that was a real step forward. And so I don't think we had any money.
No, we didn't, and she tapped, Mayor Sorrell tapped Councilor Grasso
Oh, that's
to be the liaison, and somewhere in there, Ellen went to the mayor and saw the UMass cultural planning seminar, and you asked the mayor and subsequently John Bohanko if she would let a staff person go and
Yes.
along with you. And so that kind of also started the.
Yeah. And so this blue ribbon committee, and you're all familiar with blue ribbon committees. We were both on the blue ribbon committee,
Right.
and
That began in 2000.
2000. And so the blue ribbon committee, I had done the work for Wallace and around the country, and had felt pretty strongly that we didn't want a cookie cutter cultural plan, because it's very common now, it was very common then, to hire a consultant. They wrote your cultural plan, you pasted it into what you had with a little bit of nod to what your community was. And so, first of all, we didn't have money to do that, but we decided that we had this base of information that Ellen's group had collected, and that we could do some additional data collection. But really, the messages were pretty clear coming out of the original data, that we could use that and build a cultural plan if we had a very broad-based group. And it was a very broad-based group. It largely did not include people from the cultural community. It represented history, it represented business. Of course, it had some artists and education and marketers and cultural plans and someone from the newspaper. But it was not a plan of the cultural community. It was a plan of the community. And that was very important, I think, for its credibility and for its wide reach. And so, believe it or not, and Ellen and I went over the dates on this, within 1 year of forming that committee, we did some additional focus groups, we did a community survey, we started the first Americans for the Arts community survey, and we wrote the cultural plan, all as volunteers. And one of the things that we did that I think was interesting and maybe something you'd want to do, which we discovered as we were doing our research, is we took the themes coming out of the earlier focus group and did a community-wide survey based on those themes. So it wasn't like, what do you want? What do you like? You know, as a lot of these surveys are, but we had a set of themes and we asked people to prioritize those themes. And those
I'm
themes,
going to say something about that because these surveys were distributed on postcards and published in the Portsmouth Herald.
right,
So, and those days, almost everybody still got the newspaper.
that's a-
And so it was great because it provided community access to a very large swath of the community.
Right. And we had meetings of different types that
Right.
people participated in.
Yeah.
And so, but the themes that you see in this cultural plan were kind of a coalesced, shrunken version coming out of that survey of the themes. And then because the committee itself was very broad-based, we worked to fill out these with an idea that would be in the master plan. And so things that are in the master plan are land use, right? So there were things like the public art ordinance, things that could fit in the master plan, you know, roles of business, things like that. So the other part of this was that this should be beautiful. It should be a work of art. So artists were commissioned and paid for their work. And Nancy just said she's found all the original work.
And you should hold that cover up. And for those who may not have a copy of this plan.
Yeah.
It was
It was, oh, that's right. And widely distributed, and I think a version published in the paper.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
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 There
May
was
of
a
2002.
newsprint copy of
Yes,
it,
correct.
essentially.
That's the first time I saw it.
Yeah, and it was wonderful that so many community institutions participated in and helped both by providing data, but also by distributing the plan over time.
Oh, here's a reception. November 20th, 2002. That's right. And of course, it was accepted by the city council.
I think that reception is where you announced the initial board members for Arts Week.
That's right. Right, because one of the recommendations was to create Arts Week, and so we did that.
It wasn't an appointment, it was, you had to apply.
You had to
Yes.
apply
That's
I
right.
remember we put these groups in the room to see how they work
and you
together.
talked together.
That was different.
It was, yes, and we did have good applications. And at the same time, we were doing that first survey for Americans for the Arts, so the business community was involved, all the cultural organizations were involved because they did as they do now, gave out the surveys, filled in paper. So there were things coinciding that kind of brought culture.
But it was also that it was considered a sort of arts agency, and it would be its own standalone nonprofit rather than be one of the city appointed commission. So it had a little different.
Well, because we were drawing, half the people were from Portsmouth and half not. But you know how sacred it is on our committees that people have to somehow have it implemented here. And so this was a really unusual thing that we could include artists and other people who were not part of the community, but who saw this as their community. So that's how it came about.
That's excellent. Just being respectful of Ellen's time, she's going to be here for another 5 minutes. Does anyone have any specific questions for Ellen before she leaves us today based on her opening, or any questions you might have about the plan?
I think it's probably hard to have questions
Yeah.
at this point because we're still really getting into the process.
So I do have one question. A lot was accomplished in 1 year. It really is remarkable. And I'm guessing that the lifting was done by the Blue Ribbon Committee members.
Yes.
And
And Nancy.
yeah, and city staff as well. Nancy in particular. How frequently did you meet early on? What type of, what type did you divide into sub work groups? Part of my questions about this, especially since we're moving towards this, are some of the practical issues about things that you may have learned that worked or didn't work in the way that you actually accomplished the tasks.
I think we met every other week. I think there was a lot of trust. I wouldn't say we had formal subgroups, but different people took on challenges. Lars Trodson, I don't know if people remember Lars,
Oh, I know
who
Lars,
was
yeah.
Yeah.
editor of the paper. Lars took on a lot of the writing. Ellen and I think, took on a lot of the more sort of detailed brainstorming, generating ideas. There were people who took on like managing the reception, people who took on the artwork. So people took on tasks as we moved. And partly the broad base, there's a lot of talent in that group to take on those tasks.
Was it about 15 people? In the back page here.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, yes. Yes.
And then
Russ, I have a question.
Go right ahead, Tina.
Hi there. I think I heard you say that the input was widely collected from non-arts and cultural people, or people that didn't work for or the arts and cultural organizations. Did I hear that correct?
Two things to that. It was community input, so anybody could do it, but we wanted to make sure we got community and that it wasn't only a plan. And this is Mayor Sorrell too. It wasn't a plan that of what artists wanted, it was what the community wanted for arts and culture. And I would also say the members of the committee were, there are people here that you certainly know. Nancy Carey was an art teacher at the high school, Jeff Gable, who was executive director of the music hall, Peter Haffney, Barbara Jennings, who was an art teacher then at Phillips Exeter, but many of the other people, architects, editor, marketing person. It was a balanced group. So the committee itself was part arts, people grounded in the arts, and half not.
Got it. Okay, thank you. The other question I had was relative to the plan, and are there any parts of the plan that were not completed or objectives that weren't met that you are aware of?
Yes, I would say everything was partially met, but there are specific ideas in there that haven't been met. One of the things we really wanted to do at that time was Arts Live Workspace. We did accomplish the zoning that allowed for that, but we never accomplished, we got fairly far after we had the committee itself. We even had students from MIT and Harvard develop a plan for reuse of some buildings for art workspace. We worked with some national groups on that. We never got there at that time, but we did get the zoning. So things like that, if you go through the specifics of the plan, they're probably what was happened best with cultural spaces. It's hard to remember what we didn't have back then.
Yeah.
So true.
And I think the other thing that we started and that we were unable to really continue on a robust basis was a % for Arts program that would basically create public support and allow for the placement of public art in spaces. And there was any city project over a certain amount of money was supposed to have a % for art that was set aside. And it was in some cases and in other cases that people were somehow talked out of using that money for the arts and believed that the budget was too tight and they needed to use it for.
I think that only happened on the fire station and the wastewater treatment plant. The money for the middle school still exists and it's never been used because ArtSpeak folded at that time. So I think that to me, the real thing that needs to be redone, which I was partly why we're here, is the city needs to reinvigorate and commit to an arts department and arts agency, arts and culture agency. And it reminds me to say one other thing, Alan, we talked about this. I don't know if you want to call it an arts plan anymore. We tried very hard to make it a cultural plan. History, humanities, arts, folk life, preservation, and the full cultural life of the community. And that was again kind of unique at that time. You would want to do that. That's partly why it's so broad.
So maybe things like the % for arts should instead say % for culture. And it might have more buy-in, for instance, now than it might have had with that kind of understanding of how much more inclusive it could be for the community.
Dress Barbara's.
Barbara, you go ahead and then Jay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quickly before Ellen leaves, so you both know, some of the % for art money is going to be living on in the Portsmouth 400 projects. So you're going to see things like potential projects out at Pierce Island. And I'm part of the legacy committee, and it came up in our meeting on Friday about the money you just mentioned about Portsmouth Middle School. So those funds are not forgotten, and they're kind of top of mind with Portsmouth 400 right now. And the other thing I wanted to ask you both in terms of practical, we live in such a different world 20 years later. Volunteerism is not what it used to be. We have to accept that. And so one of the things that we've talked about just a little bit as we start to move on with this is, would Portsmouth Listens be a good partner for us in terms of community outreach? Wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I think one of the things that was different about this was that it had its own brand from the beginning. I think you would want to have its own brand from the beginning. It doesn't mean you have to do it all as volunteers. And I don't think we're suggesting that, because Barbara, you make such a good point. And we just kept saying, how did we do all this? You know, we were both working full time. I traveled at least half the month for my job. And everybody on this group was working. It is different now. So it isn't that you wouldn't hire out some things, but I think it's really important to have your own brand and be perceived as neutral as possible. Because that was the real concern when we did this was from artists. They thought the government was going to tell them what art to do. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the only negativity that ever came about was from individual artists who were fearful that somehow they'd be co-opted. And you can kind of understand that. Again, it was a different time. But I think there's a neutrality and a brand specialness to it that you should really work to preserve.
And the other thing that I would say before I have to leave now is that there was a lot of support from the city itself. Nancy was an incredibly important person to this, and her access to the services of the city, and also to making sure that the city government knew what we were doing. And not only, you know, the mayor and the city manager, two people who were very important, just to be sure that everybody knew what was happening. So it wasn't, we weren't out there, we were in here, so to speak. Do you agree with that?
And it was very important because Nancy also had to be sort of a translator for us. It was like, so what parts of arts fit with planning, you know, with master planning, with land use. And so we needed to kind of have that bridge.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
Thank you for your time, Ellen. We'll be in touch. We'll, yeah,
We'll
we'll
be
definitely
happy
have more
to
questions, yeah.
answer other questions.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Barbara really touched upon, you know, part of my question. It was really having to do with the change landscape. Obviously, we've got some very strong, you know, arts organizations that have grown, you know, over this last 20 years.
Right, that's right.
And yes, there might be more challenges with getting the citizen to volunteer. So, you know, I guess I'm curious about some of your thoughts about opportunities. You know, there's an interconnectedness that comes through the advent and increase of social media. You know, how do we harness how do we get that citizen re-engaged? But also obviously, you know, include these strong arts brands that we really have now.
Yeah. So one thing I think is important is to figure out how this fits with initiative overload. And, you know, with the, Barbara's mentioned the Portsmouth 400. So is this something that should come out of the Portsmouth 400 and that you should harness the kinds of things that are being learned through the Portsmouth 400 and then the planning group emerges from that, as opposed to recreating the wheel? But yes, I mean, this is before social media, this is before, you know, everybody was on their devices all the time. So collecting basic information is really easy. The ideas though came out of interaction. You know, you want to do the survey and the input and all of that to let people have their say, but really the ideas came out of interaction. I don't, you know, we haven't had a lot of that lately. And I think people would be very interested in participating in that. All of the groundwork we did for the 400 is exactly the same groundwork that you need for this. So I wouldn't recreate that wheel. I mean, the last thing people want to be asked for over and over is what they think about things. You know, just like the Artsville community was a base for our cultural plan, I think those focus groups we did now, what, 3 or 4 years ago, and all of that information that we had hundreds of people provide for the 400 may be the basis for the cultural. You know, it's the thinking about it, the synthesis, what does it say to us about what's needed going forward for the next 5 to 10 years. That's the thinking part of a group that you would task. I mean, I don't see you doing, you guys have a different purpose. I see you selecting a group to take it forward rather than maybe taking it on. And especially the cultural organizations have a lot on their plates right now. So I can see how thinking of that as volunteer would be challenging. But I would first look to that wealth of information and all the themes that came out of that as the basis for what does this say to us going forward.
Excellent. Other questions at this point? Could you talk a little bit about how you eventually got to 6 primary goal areas or feature areas in the plan? And I'm assuming that came out of the
Those
the
themes.
surveys
Yeah.
and those themes came out, but you know, could you dive a little deeper into how that all came to be?
Mhm. I didn't bring with me, but Ellen and I found the little survey cards. I think there were 10 on that. There were 10 big themes that had come out of the earlier Artsville community. And we really asked people to rank. And then we looked at that information ourselves and tried to coalesce it. We knew that you know, we're starting from nothing, so you don't want to put out, again, one thing you'll see in a lot of people's cultural plans is pages and pages of lists of things that we need, things we want to do. We wanted this to be, and those never go anywhere. They sit on people's shelves and they're used in the appendices of grants. We wanted this to be actionable, so we knew we couldn't have too many. Oh my God, she has the actual data.
Where was this, was that in the paper?
This is cut out
I
of the
see it,
paper.
looks like an ad on the back,
So,
yeah, I'll be
We
darned.
should explain for those on Zoom what it is.
It's a give us your opinion survey from the paper, and the actual documents are here. Um,
Wow.
And they ask people to rank, not important, kind of, very important. And they ask them for their favorite piece of public art. Oh, something else that we were doing at the time was we were part of the National Smithsonian Save Our Sculpture. Alan and I were team members of that. So we documented all the public art on facades and public sculpture, and that's at the Smithsonian. That was, we also did that same year.
And can you imagine people had to like cut that out?
They cut it out and they
That's awesome.
returned it, and you saved it.
See, here's even an envelope they put in. I mean, that's wild.
Would anybody have any idea how many of those were actually submitted or returned?
Probably
Oh my God,
somewhere.
that's awesome, that's so cool to see.
And they wrote
That's something we
little
said through
letters
this
that
stuff. That's so cool.
came with it.
I like the simplicity of it, in that it made it easily accessible for a lot of people to respond. You didn't feel like you had to set aside a lot of thinking time to respond to this, but it does get to the core of how people value different aspects of it.
And people are volunteers, a letter of a person who's volunteering, and we had a lot of people that volunteered to want to be a part of it. That's why we created an application form, because we had so many.
Wow, what a nice problem to have. Too many volunteers.
Yeah, but the hardest, I think our biggest struggle was, as you said, the individual artists, and we didn't know how to get that, so we went out and, you know, individually and kind of sat with people on the sidewalk, or went to where we knew they might be performing. Just kind of cornered them, and you need to be part of this, because it's such a big part of the cultural, you know, community here.
Robin, it was paused for only a short time. And then it was reinstated but never acted on. Yeah, so I think the simplicity of it is really important. Again, there were simpler times and we had so much less happening and so much less going on. But I do think the simplicity of it allowed people who aren't already in the Beltway to participate and feel like they have something to say. I think that's important.
So that survey that appeared in the paper and was on postcards, basically you brought together the results of that survey, the weighted results of what the community thought, to kind of prioritize how you were going to create the different section areas of the plan.
Section areas, but then the committee itself had to brainstorm. And this is where Nancy played an important role, because again, we were trying to push ourselves toward a land use plan. So the committee itself then had to brainstorm within each of these, well, what would be actionable? You know, what do we see for needs and what would be actionable? And as you go through them, you'll see that some are really aspirational and some are pretty practical. And it's probably the aspirational ones, you know, Tina, like for example, create a centralized cultural arts center in a facility owned by the city. could be reuse of the library. So we sort of have that.
Yep.
And, you know, one of the things that I think helped, and somebody asked about the Rock Street. Here was a suggestion of creating neighborhood arts centers, arts activities similar to Parks and Recreation. An example could be to do something in Rock Street Park. So, and then the city could use this opportunistically as plans came up and opportunities.
You know, I wondered last week when we had Ben show us the part of Portsmouth landing pages, and you know, he had those couple questionnaires. I wonder if we could somehow use that as a vehicle to capture some of the information that we're talking about here, you know, before that goes live, because I know he only had a couple questions there.
The only response to that, but we're targeting that outside of the Portsmouth area.
Yeah. Okay, that's true. Good point.
I mean, one thing could even be to start with these themes and ask people to add,
Mhm.
you know, or start with the themes, take a look at what's been accomplished, what hasn't, and why. You know, understand why some things haven't been accomplished, and then build from there. And that could be an empowered committee to do that. I mean, you could do that in a retreat setting in half a day.
We did have an intern go through the plan and report out on the status of it, so that in part exists. So that might be an interesting.
How
Chris-
long? Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, sorry. Hey, Chris, I was wondering, you know, to build off of it might be better to go a different route from Portsmouth Listens. I totally get that. Then I would also think the same might be true of the chamber. I mean, they've been a good partner on this marketing proposal we're doing, but the vast majority, well, residents certainly aren't part of it. And I'm thinking the vast majority of businesses aren't part of it. So we shouldn't, I know it was just a comment about the chamber's website and this marketing, but I think we better steer clear of that too if we're going to truly be independent and focus on the community at large. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think all those people are really important contributors to the content and to the vetting and all of that. But I think it's really important to really try to do something. That's why, you know, just the broad call for data is important. So I think so, Barbara. I mean, obviously you all, but I think so. I mean, it's also when you read the marketing here, you know, at that time, the chamber had nothing to do with the arts. You know, it's only in our recent iterations, the chamber rebranded itself to include the arts, but at that time, so you'll see in here, marketing and business is such a separate thing. So many of those silos have kind of come together. It's great.
Yeah, I think that the influence of the cultural plan kind of is bubbling under the surface everywhere in our community. And what you see happening with the chamber is even part of that. The question I had was there any thought given to the longevity of the plan when you actually created it? And
Yeah,
what you
I
thought the
think
timing of it? Does
I
it say
think
in
we
there?
said 10 years.
10 years,
It even
okay,
says in here, but
Got it.
yeah, it certainly wasn't.
20 years.
Question?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Is that, I can't tell who that was. Is that Nico? Go ahead.
Nico and then Robin.
Russ has told us a lot, or at least got myself to speak about the lasting influence of this last cultural plan. I'm wondering why that's been the case. How was this document used in decision-making after it was written? What was important for that?
That's easy, because the last goal is create an arts and culture agency. And that's what happened, and they were charged exclusively with
That was our team.
implementing the cultural plan.
I also think the broad, you know, timing timing was good. The broad base of involvement was good. I would say, I told this to Ellen, you know, when I first ran for city council, which was shortly after this, and people knew that I was associated with arts and culture, people used it as to make fun of what I was proposing. People used it to denigrate. Some of the same people who walked out of this room earlier used it to denigrate that. By the second time I ran for council, every candidate had an arts platform. So that a lot of it was people just not understanding how woven in it was in our community, and partly by lifting up the, you know, it was like, yeah, everybody likes this. Everybody wants to participate. This isn't for like a few elite people.
And I think, you know, Chris deserves a lot of credit because she brought the American for the Arts Economic Prosperity Study forward to the council or the mayor. And the first time we did it, it was transformative.
It was.
It really was, because nowhere else had the council seen a quantitative value for
Right.
this entity. And then going forward, as soon as we had something that was concrete, we never looked back, and the number kept going up every 5 years. So I think you can't underestimate how important.
The economic part was, yeah, and I think that started to bring the chamber on board and brought more businesses on board. And then the council could also see the value.
Any observations, you know, one of the things that's really important to me, you know, having grown up in Portsmouth, I get a lot of friends who say, well, this isn't my Portsmouth anymore.
Yeah,
And like, oh, well, the arts aren't for me, you know, and you just referenced, you know, it's not for this elitist small group, this is for Portsmouth. Any observations from your work 20 years ago that you would recommend to us to engage community, to engage the neighborhoods? I heard you talk a little bit about neighborhood groups.
yes.
Really want this to be as inclusive as possible to the people.
Neighborhood groups, very important. The neighborhood committee, which I don't believe existed back then, or
No.
it did in a different way, would be a great, to Barbara's questions, they would be an interesting group to see if we could do this. Mayor Sorrell's original vision has not been implemented, which was that we would have arts going on in neighborhoods. The closest I think of that is our redo of the Plain Schoolhouse for Pontine. So that has become a neighborhood place, the Plain Schoolhouse, and they get neighborhood people coming to meetings. They've had memorial services there for people in the neighborhood. And, you know, in some cities, there are community centers in neighborhoods, larger cities than ours. But to think of what this time would really say that would be from a history perspective, from a community life perspective, from a folk traditions perspective, from an arts perspective, what could really happen? And I think that would be a different branding. That doesn't mean that those wouldn't be connected to our major institutions, our downtown institutions, but could that be something we would think about differently? And, you know, that would infuse the cultural life forward into it. But the other part that you raised, I think is really important to take on during this, you know, isn't our Portsmouth anymore, because sometimes I used to say this as a counselor, older people would sometimes say, well, I don't go downtown anymore because I don't know anybody anymore. My friends have died, they're gone, I don't know anybody. And then other older people who we can all think of who know everybody. And so, but how can we help more people network and feel that, and that's what the cultural life is, right? So the cultural life is the network for feeling like it is your Portsmouth. That seems to be a theme that was important back then, and I don't think we achieved, and I think it's really important.
Robin, you had a question earlier.
You really already answered it. I just was going to remind everyone, or remind me even, when we do a timeline of this project, putting in when we're actually going to get the AFTA data and when we want to roll out the AFTA data. But you guys all mentioned really how important it is.
But it's going to be important not to have that, somehow that the weightiness of that has to not be outbalanced with what we just talked about. Because that looks like it isn't, I know, and the data shows it. So something that our data shows and has always shown is that the people who are responding are more locals than tourists. And any of us who run cultural organizations know that. For the most part, they may be people who don't live here, but who live in a 20, 30-mile range. But there's a tendency for people to feel that that is the outsiders, as opposed to this is for us. I think sometimes people are surprised how many of us take advantage of all the things that are here. So I think your timeline's really important. You've got the 400, you've got the AFTA data, you've got the master plan. This has to kind of find its way into all those pieces.
Barbara, you had a question?
I was just about to go there, Chris. The different committees in the 400 are already looking to work with the neighborhood association because some of the celebrations won't take place downtown in Portsmouth. They'll take place in a neighborhood. That's one thing. And then the other thing, I let the whole group know next week, the recreation department is doing a survey about their programming. And like I said to the group, I have zero issues with athletic activity, zero. But I wrote to them and asked them if we could have a seat at the table, because they're also talking about the community campus and thinking ahead that, one of the points in your plan, I'm sure will live on in some form in the next one, which is not only living space, but space for creating art and for gathering people to create art, because we still don't really have that. Like when we lost the Connie Bean, they call that gym at the middle school the Connie Bean, but it's not the Connie Bean, it's a gym. And so something along the lines of what many of us knew of the Connie Bean, a gathering place, if that could, whether it's at the community campus or, I asked the city council to buy the North Church building on Spinney Road. That's my dream, but I don't know that that'll happen. But to your earlier point about, Discover Portsmouth almost being a cultural hub, but is there a way to really create a cultural hub? Where some of us could even reside as having our HQ. So our timing is fortuitous in that the 400 is happening. The rec department is looking at what is recreation going to be in Portsmouth. And here we are wanting to do a cultural plan. I see it as possibly dovetailing in lots of these different areas.
I think that's really great, Barbara. In Europe and in United Nations work on culture, recreation is part of culture. Recreation and leisure are embodied within it. So embracing the recreational aspect of this, I think, is really important. Something else that was going on at the same time that we were doing this was the building reuse committee. I forgot.
Yeah,
So-
on that file too.
Yeah. So at the same time, we were working on the reuse of all the buildings we did the Discoveries, the Players Ring, the Discovery Center, the Children's Museum. So bringing up building reuse and connecting it to this is very important. The other thing I would say I chaired the Prescott Park master planning process. And the thing I think that you remember how contentious that was at the beginning, and that nobody thought that we could actually get a plan out of it. But I think one thing that really worked there is we did our data collection in the park. Remember, we took people on walks in the park, and then they would fill out a survey after that. I could see a wonderful opportunity for gatherings at different cultural places in the community for people to give their input. Because we get so much, even from some of our meanest critics, we had great walks in the park with landscape architects and people actually being in place and seeing, visioning in place what could happen. I could see something similar with some of the spaces that you mentioned, you know, to vision what reuse could be.
Other questions or comments? I usually like to close sessions like this by asking the person who has the hindsight and done this before what either they would do differently if they had the opportunity to do it again, or you know, what you learned from the process that was unexpected.
What we would do differently. I think there's too much in here.
Too many objectives.
Too many objectives. I think we coalesce on fewer things. You know, not fewer themes, but fewer ideas within each. And I think maybe be clearer about who could take some of this up. You know, I remember talking at this point, I don't think it's in here, that we wanted to do a percent for art with the idea that eventually private developers would do this on their own. And we never imagined that that would be possible. And of course now that's what happens, right? I think I would be clearer about timeline and what could be done within like a 1 to 2 year, you know, organizing this in a little bit. What could be done in a 1 to 2 year? What is really aspirational? It's great to have some aspirational things, but I think we should have been clearer about, you know, organize it a little bit better and have fewer things. So for sure in the plan itself, you know, my business is collecting data. I think we're going on fairly thin data, but there's also a tendency to be paralyzed by data. So that's why I'm suggesting you might reuse what you've already collected for Portsmouth 400. That put more time into the planning and thinking and less time into just mindlessly collecting it. Even though it worked for us, people are so over surveys. You can always get people to want to talk to each other or do interviews.
It's just about finding the right way for people to feel like they've been heard as part of the process.
That's right.
Well, thank you for your time today. It's very much
It's been really
appreciated.
helpful.
Thank you, really helpful. And
It's that.
we'll touch base again, I'm sure. But thank you, everyone. We have
Thank you,
our next
Chris.
meeting- Oh, yes. And we have our next meeting in April. So we'll see everyone then. But have a good rest of your March. Thank you.
Thank you.